Good morning, everyone, and welcome to VCOSS's annual pre-budget briefing. It's fantastic to be here with you all today, and I'm very pleased to be able to present David Hayward as our guest speaker, who I'll introduce in a moment for this annual event. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that we are meeting on unceded Aboriginal land. We're in the CBD of Melbourne here on Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung land, and I'd like to pay my respect to elders and ancestors of the Wurundjeri people, and also extend that respect to any First Nations people joining with us today. Many of you, I'm sure, on this meeting will have been involved in or attended or seen social media around the Women Deliver conference this week, a really important international gathering of feminist leaders and thinkers and change makers. I was very pleased to attend earlier this week and to see those beautiful Jiri dancers open the event with such a beautiful way to celebrate Wurundjeri connection to country and culture in this landscape since time immemorial. Headed up as well by a beautiful welcome from Auntie Di. I'd also like to acknowledge the Aboriginal community-controlled organisations that we work with and are very proud to walk alongside in our collective journey towards truth, justice and treaty. So Victorian Budget Day is almost here, and it's probably fair to say that it couldn't come at a more high-stakes time. I don't want to preempt what David will talk about in a moment, but we are all, I'm sure, painfully aware that recent events, including the current fuel crisis, have added more stress and strain to what was already a very, very significant cost of living and housing crisis, a strain for household budgets and services that were already stretched. So people are really watching closely to see how this government and this budget responds. Now, it is a one-year budget, so it won't be read in isolation. Of course, with a state election looming in November this year, the government's choices over the next couple of weeks will signal what it values and what it's prepared to fight for across the full term of the next term of government. And we wait, like everyone else, for details of that next Tuesday on Budget Day. So in terms of today's session, it's going to run for about 60 minutes, and really our intention is to give you a bit of a sense of what we think is coming up. David is, of course, very well known to the sector and in the public debate around the fiscal situation and social and economic policy for Victoria. And so first up, we're going to hear from David. And he will provide a detailed briefing about the economic and political context of this year's budget. And then in the second part of our session today, we'll turn to your questions. We have a full 15 minutes earmarked for your questions. And so please feel free to bring those questions through in the Q&A function on your Zoom meeting. So we should have plenty of time, hopefully, to dig into questions with you, David, and thank you for your generosity in being here for that. And finally, we'll round out the session today with a bit of a summary of what you can expect from VCOSS in the week ahead, both on Budget Day itself and subsequently. So we'll have a couple of further a moment for questions if there are any after that. So on that note, it gives me a very great pleasure to welcome our guest presenter today, David, who many of you will be familiar with, both as a very dear friend of VCOSS over very many years, and some of you might remember him as a former board member, actually, of VCOSS, but also, most importantly, David is a veteran economist, academic and commentator on economic and social affairs. You might have seen him in the news, in The Age, on the ABC radio, and in a great many other places as well. So this is David's 7th year of presenting this event for VCOSS, and we are so grateful for his time and expertise. So without further ado, over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Juanita, and it's always a pleasure to be doing things for VCOSS, because VCOSS does such a great job for Victorians. We've got something like 140 participants today, which is fantastic from my point of view. I never thought we'd get 140 people listening into a seminar on the budget. So I'm particularly pleased that we've got that. What I want to talk about today is to put the budget into context. When people hear people talking about budgets, they tend to fall asleep or think that sounds very boring. It's not actually boring, but you do need to know how to look at a budget in order to make sense of it. And for you who are coming into the budget for the first time this year, you're going to find that you've got quite a stiff test, because you get a few hours to look through a lot of material and then form a judgment, and you might end up on the media giving an assessment. So it's like a speedy test where you've got to read an awful lot. I'm not going to be turning my slides today. I'm going to be leaving that to Amy. So Amy, if I could get the next slide, please. What is it? Look, I'm going to talk about the budget in two senses. One is how do you approach it, and the other one is how do you read it. So just in terms of approaches to the budget, what I always do is that I try to think about what's the context, what's the political context, what's the economic context. I like to look at both, because it's not just about finance, it's about values, power. So what's the political context? One bit of it is that it is the core part of the parliamentary system. It's the way that we hold governments for account for spending and taxing. It's a particularly important part of the political cycle. But it is tricky. There's something like 5 volumes of materials that go over literally thousands of pages. You're talking about $115 billion of operating expenses and another $20 billion of capital expenses. How on earth are you going to make sense of that? And that's part of the political riddle that you're challenged with. How do you make sense of such a lot of material in such a short period of time? Next slide, thanks, Amy. Because it is very easy to trick and deceive. Well, let's start with the politics. And as Juanita mentioned before, remember, this is an election year. So first and foremost, this budget is being framed with that in mind. November 2026, the goal is to spend and tax in ways that maximises the chance of re-election. But just remember that this budget doesn't actually take effect for another 2 months, right? It's the next financial year. We've got 2 more months to go before that starts. And remember, it's going to play through until 30th of June next year. So the question is, for the last budget of a political cycle, how much of an impact is it going to have on an election? Probably not a lot, but what they'll be wanting to do is to frame as much of the budget spending as possible in the lead up to that big day in November, to try and fix problems and whatever they can. I'm not one who thinks that budgets have a big impact on people's attitudes towards political parties. I think what matters most is people's lived experience. Is it getting tougher or easier to get access to services? Are taxes going up? Are they going down? That kind of thing matters more than what happens in the budget. A couple of things to bear in mind. We've got 2 wars going on in the background. One is Trump's war in the Middle East, which is putting pressure on prices. So we've got inflation. There's also a question about, is it going to drag down economic growth? If it drags down economic growth, the budget is going to be tougher than it would otherwise be. Leading up to this budget, Treasury will be doing last-minute calculations trying to estimate what is the impact of this turbulence, economic turbulence, on the economy. And remarkably, actually, just looking back over the last few years, Victoria's done very, very well out of the pandemic, partly because the Victorian Government decided to spend its way out of the pandemic, and it worked. So the Victorian economy has been travelling well. Will it continue to do so over the next 12 months? Well, that's a big question mark. Bear in mind what's also important for this budget, the government's struggling in the polls. Doesn't matter which poll you look at, it looks like it's going to be a very tight thing. The support for the government, primary support, is down to the lowest level it's been for a very long time. The rise of One Nation, the shift of political values to the right, pretty evident. In some ways, what's made worse is it looks like the government has lost its policy puff. For many years, it was extremely good at coming up with new policies that would be eye-catching just at the moment when things look like they're turning a bit sour. What we can say is that the next slide, thanks, Amy. The voters have kind of given a pretty good indication of what matters for them, and top of mind is cost of living. So the particular figure that you've got there is from Ipsos. It's the Ipsos Issues Monitor from March 2026. And you'll see that cost of living is the #1 concern for Victorians and for the rest of Australia. #2 is crime, and #3 is housing, and then the others slip away. Now, one of the things you'll note there is that nobody's really all that concerned about debts or deficits or and the economy is not really a big issue for most people. The big ones are cost of living and crime. The question, I think, for a state government is how much do people think that cost of living issues are a state issue versus a Commonwealth issue? My bet is that most people probably put it down to Commonwealth, not state. And when you think about what state governments do, service delivery and infrastructure, there's probably not a lot that can be done well if you focus on cost of living alone. So if you get your spending priorities wrong, you might not get any political reward at election time. Next slide, thanks, Amy. Just a couple of things that I thought I'd draw your attention to. A lot of the media narrative is based at the moment in Victoria is based around a kind of a moral panic about state debt. Now, this moral panic has been going on for about 5 years now, and it's strange that it's something that is the particular focus for Victoria, because some of the other states are doing it a bit tougher than Victoria on some of the measures. So Queensland's budget deficit, as it's measured, is something for this financial year is running at about $9 billion, right? It's running a very big deficit. New South Wales is running a deficit of around about $4 billion, but you don't see the media talking about those states in the same way that they do about Victoria. The other thing to bear in mind when people talk about the level of debt, you've always got to think, what was the debt used for? Was the money just frittered away? Well, basically, no. The money was spent building up the state's asset base. You hear a lot about $178, $200 billion in debt. You don't hear a lot said about the $460-odd billion of assets. And that's a critical factor. So we've got many more assets than liabilities. And it's not a bad thing to remind people of that if they talk about being concerned about debt. The debt crisis argument is massively overstated. There is no debt crisis. Basically, the money has been spent wisely and well. It's about $30 billion of it that was built up during the pandemic, but they're actually paying that off through a targeted plan. One of the other contextual factors I thought would be interesting for you to think about, one of the things for governments is that they get locked into a spending profile, and it becomes difficult then to work out how are they going to carve out spending to fund new initiatives. It's a bit tricky in Victoria, especially post-pandemic, because spending on health in particular went up dramatically, and it hasn't come down. It's remained elevated. So we've had a very big growth in the health workforce, very big increase in health spending. A couple of years ago, the Treasurer Palace tried to cut back on health spending, and the health services kicked up a fuss and they got their money back. Trouble is, if you're trying to carve out savings, it means that the other non-health areas have to bear the brunt of the adjustment. And that brings us to the Silver Review, which was a review undertaken by Helen Silver. Have we got that slide up, Amy, the Silver Review? I just wasn't sure if I asked you to click it forward. And what she did was that she was hired by the Treasurer to look at ways of generating savings from the budget. And actually, the report was pretty good. And from the government's point of view, they'll be keen to find savings in a way that there's not very much political pain. It kind of landed pretty well because the unions have said, yep, that's actually pretty fair. They don't mind that so much of the attention is on senior executives or senior public servants. And so they put in place savings which are pretty substantial. They're in the budget, last year's budget of about $3 billion of savings. In the budget update last December, they talked about another $200 to $300 million that's coming forward. So they've carved out the money that they need to have available for new initiatives coming into this election year, and they've done it without terribly much pain. I put in on that slide, you can see that the only 2.8% of all job cuts in that Silver Review are in health, even though it counts for about 33% or a third of all job growth in the public service over the last 5 or 6 years. All right, so that's the context. Money has been carved out. They've done that successfully. That was a difficult job. What can we expect moving into the budget? Next slide, thanks. And where do you look? Well, when I go into the budget lockup, the first budget paper that I look at is budget paper 2, which is the budget strategy and outlook. Don't look at budget paper 1. That's the political document that the Treasurer wants people to read, but it's really just political guff. It's not worth reading. I never read budget paper number 1. It sends out the political message. It's a communication document with very little of substance. I go straight to budget paper number 2 because it has key budget aggregates. What's happening with the budget? Is it the deficit? Is it moving into deficit? Is it a surplus? It is a bigger surplus. You can get all the information that you want about projections for economic growth. Is the economy projected to grow? Is it projected to shrink? What about inflation, job growth? So you can get a bird's eye picture, and it also indicates what are the new initiatives, recurrent initiatives, and capital initiatives. So you get all of that as a bird's eye view. That's why I like to go there to begin with. Next slide, Amy. And I think what you'll find this year is that the budget will move back, the operating budget will move back into surplus, a small surplus. They're on track. They're meeting the targets they set themselves when they put in place the coronavirus savings plan to deal with the debt that was built up during the pandemic. It's a pretty big year this year because they're going to say, look, we've done it. We did it. We achieved the surplus. We've gone back into the black. But it's going to be small, it won't be large. And if anything, if the past is anything to go by, any of the extra savings that's been generated will be spent. This is not a government that's keen on saving or delivering a bigger surplus than has been expected. Their preference has been to spend rather than to save. Remember that the budget as a whole will be in substantial deficit because of capital spending. That big build is still got a huge momentum. They're borrowing a lot of money to build bridges, hospitals, all sorts of things. So the overall deficit will, the overall budget will be in deficit, but largely because of infrastructure. Remember, just to go back a couple of slides ago, that's what I was saying with the debt. No need to be alarmed about the debt because it's being used to fund infrastructure. Infrastructure lasts a long time and it's productive. It should deliver a productivity dividend. In that sense, it should pay it for itself over the longer term. Just one other thing that I thought I'd draw attention to. Victoria, again, was pretty lucky with the Grants Commission allocation this year. They've probably ended up, I haven't checked the figure, but I think they've ended up with about 500 million more than they expected to. Victoria's been compensated, as it should do, for the extra spending it incurred during the pandemic relative to the other states. So it's done pretty well. The other states aren't very happy, but of course it's pretty good for Victoria, and I think quite a justified extra amount that we're getting from the Commonwealth. That money from the Commonwealth, from the Grants Commission, that's the GST revenues, and the GST revenues make up around about half of the state budget, so it's a substantial sum of money. Just remember that the state budget is not just funded by state taxes and charges. There's a big chunk that comes from Commonwealth grants. Next slide. Thanks, Amy. So, all right, you look at budget paper 2, what are you going to be interested in from there? Well, the key issue is spending and I guess taxing, increasing or falling. And what I do, I always look at new initiatives. What's the government promising for new output initiatives? Said budget paper 2 has the broad indication of how much. If you want to look at the more detailed picture of the initiatives, you go to another budget paper, which I'll talk to presently. But I like to look at the new initiatives because it gives you a sense of whether the government is becoming more generous or less generous relative to the previous years. For the last 5 years, the new initiatives have been mounting quite dramatically. This has not been a government that's been afraid to spend. But it's really important to look at the new initiatives less efficiency. So how much has been carved out of other programs to fund the new initiatives, like where did the money come from? And it's also important to take account of the, is the spending increasing in real terms or just nominal terms? And what do I mean by that? Well, if spending on homelessness, for example, increases by 2%, but inflation's running at about 4%, the current rate, 4.5%, that's not good. That means in real terms, the spending is declining. Right, the real spend has declined. If you then also take into account population growth, the picture will be even worse because Victoria's population is growing by about 1.5 to 2% a year. So you need to take account the population growth and inflation. And if you're thinking, well, how would I work that out when I'm sitting in the budget lockup? Remember that budget paper 2 has it all in there. If you go to the chapter on the economy, it's got all of the assumptions. So you can go to there and then have a look at, right, CPI growth, consumer price increases, X%, population growth is X%, add the two together, and your program, you want to see that spending increase by those two numbers combined, more than those two numbers combined. If it's less than that, you're going backwards. So it's really important to take that into account. Next slide. Thank you, Amy. So I did mention earlier that you've got 5 budget papers to choose from. I said, don't look at budget paper number 1 because that's just the communications piece. Start with budget paper number 2. Now, the other budget papers that you've got to choose from, budget paper number 3 is service delivery. That's quite a helpful volume. It's a big fat volume, but it's where you can have a look at, in more detail at the new initiatives because they're all listed. So you go there to see, well, okay, what are they doing in education, in health, in families, fairness and housing, all the new initiatives that listed in there going forward into the out years or the next 3 years. But then you also get detailed information by program spending within departments. So, for example, in health, you can look at how much is being spent on hospitals. Now, be careful with that. Be really careful. I get a lot of questions about how useful is that information in that budget paper. Not very helpful. And it's not very helpful because the government is setting aside so much money in contingencies each year. Last year, it was about $3.5 billion in contingencies. You say, what are contingencies? Well, they're spending that's subject to meeting performance indicators, milestones. There's an arbitrariness to it. If you have a look at what was budgeted and what was spent across most of the portfolios, there's been quite a significant gap. So in health last year, it was 1.5 billion, I think, more spent in health than was budgeted. And then you can find individual programs where you've got the budget, they didn't deliver the budget, they went backwards. And you look at the footnote, it says, well, it's because there was efficiency dividends extracted during the course of the year. So what number do you want to pay attention to when you're looking at it? Well, you're going to have a budget figure there, right? What was budgeted for last year, but then you're going to have the actual. Now, what I would be doing if I was you and I was trying to work out where you're sitting, I'd look at both numbers, but the number that matters most is actual. If the actual was 100 million, right, and they're going to be spending 90 million, that's backwards, even though that might be an increase on the budgeted amount last year. The tricky bit about this is that as the year progresses, you know what, they'll be releasing contingencies and in actual terms, they might end up spending more. That's why I say that service delivery budget paper is of limited use, and I wouldn't be too caught up on it. I really wouldn't, but it's a good talking point with the Treasury officials who will be in the room. They are, by the way, an enormously helpful resource. They're there to help. You can ask them anything you want, and they'll provide you with that assistance. The other budget paper that I look at is the state capital program, which we, as part of the social service sector, tend not to look at, but it's where you'll find details of all of the new big build projects, what new hospitals are being funded, what new train lines, what new roads. There's a lot of money in there, and it's worth just having a look at if you get a moment and focus on your particular area if it's relevant to you. And I mean, it depends on the area. If it's homelessness services or family violence services, it may be that it's not of interest to you, but it's a very useful budget paper to go to in certain circumstances, and it's certainly one that I look at. The fifth budget paper is Statement of Finances. This isn't so useful, I think, for you. It's very useful for me because it gives very detailed information about the accounting in the budget, and it also gives detailed information on the state's revenues, what's happening to taxes. Anybody who's interested in gambling taxes, for example, or some of those really nasty taxes, and things like fees and fines, which are another really bad thing from my point of view because they're heavily regressive, you can have a look at all that in the Statement of Finances. So it's useful there, but it also gives interesting information for me, people like me, on things like contingencies. That's where you can have a look at how much slack there is in the budget or how much wiggle room there is to increase spending during the course of the financial year beyond what's budgeted for. And that contingency amount, as I said, it's 3.5 billion last year. It's getting bigger each year, which in a way is making the budget less helpful as a guide to what the government is doing. It's sort of like it's becoming less effective as a tool of accountability within the parliamentary system, which is why there's been quite a lot of criticism about that in recent times. Next slide, Amy. Now some tricks. So what tricks can you expect to see in the budget papers? Well, one of them I already referred to, which was that issue in the budget paper on service delivery where you see a budgeted amount and then you've got an actual amount, and the budget and the actual end up being so far at variance that you don't know which number to look at. But things like self-publicity, and you'll see a lot of that. If you read Chip Legrand's article in the Age today, you'll see he was talking about the biggest ever. We're spending more on this than ever before. Well, you know what? It's not that difficult to do that in times of inflation, because just with inflation, the dollar amounts just get bigger. The other thing that they'll do is that they'll do things like, I've said here, somewhere over the rainbow. So you'll go, well, we're spending a record amount on social housing, which is exactly what the government has said this year. 700, some eye-popping amount, which looks on the face of it to be a tremendous increase. It's over 10 years, $70 million a year. That's nothing, right? So it's another way of tricking people to make it appear to be generous when in reality it isn't. Another thing to get used to with reading budget papers is what I've called this blowhard thing, or making things look big when they're actually small. So for most people, $1 million is a lot of money, right? You're talking about a budget of 115 billion. You say that you're increasing spending by 10, 20, 30 million. That sounds like a lot. All right. And that's what you'll see, a lot of that sort of stuff, tricking you with the absolute numbers. And you've always got to compare that absolute number to something else in order to work out whether it's a genuinely big amount or whether it's actually quite small. As I said, in particular, those, you might have seen Sarah Tui say something about this. The amount they're allocating for social housing is quite tiny. It's not very good at all. I think it'll lead to a net addition of about 700 dwellings a year. It's nowhere near the 4,000 or 5,000 that the Infrastructure Victoria said we need to narrow that gap between where we are now and where we should be. And the other one, just a warning about privatisations, which are always presented as a magic pudding. You know what? They're never a magic pudding. Somebody always pays. A classic example, the Westgate Tunnel. Well, we're paying for that through tolls that have been increased and for longer in other parts of the tollway. So it didn't come for free. Somebody's paying for it. And usually if it's privatised, it's more expensive than its government. Somebody's got to make a return. There's usually a marketing cost, and there's usually higher executive salaries, all that kind of thing that happens. Privatisation does not save money. It does not save money in energy, and it certainly does not in care. So just some things to be wary of. Whatever it is that you see, whatever the press releases are, treat them at face value. They will use the numbers in a way that make things look much better than they actually are. Next slide, thanks. Amy, well, a theme, there's always a theme to these budget papers. They have a fancy picture on the front cover and they'll have some slogan. I think that the theme will be, we've got this, right? We've carried Victoria through terrible times. Budget's now back in the black. You can trust us to secure your future in difficult times. Look at the rabble on the other side, the racists we've got over here, all that kind of thing you'll hear. The Silver Review has cleverly marked out some savings, which the government can put to good use. They haven't had the big pushback from the unions. There's more debt-funded infrastructure on the way. And remember, the way that Daniel Andrews structured the budget, Tim Pella structured the budget, it's to deliver a continuous stream of infrastructure. It's going to shrink the amount of additional infrastructure, but there's a massive amount still coming. There's a huge amount coming. It's locked in. Budget is back in the black, so they'll be celebrating that. And they'll be hoping that the combination of all that together with initiatives will help them get across the line towards in November. Next slide. Thanks, Amy. All right, just some concluding thoughts. So I think the government will be hoping that this gives the impression that they're now back moving again after a few years of being slow to get to get new policies out. We'll wait and see. I'm sure that's what they're hoping, that they've loaded up the budget for doing new things, better things. One of the problems that they got, the big build appears to have been tarnished by the CFMEU issue and the building bad publicity in the Age and Channel 9. That makes it a bit tricky. But remember what I said at the beginning, what matters most for people, it's not what's written in the glossiness, it's lived experience. You get a new road, get a new train line, well, that's probably a bit more important than anything else. We've actually got more than, we've probably got about 1.5 billion of announcements so far. So the government is opening up the checkbook. These are more announcements that we've heard in the lead up to this budget than we did the last budget. A lot of it seems to be focused on cost of living, a little bit on road maintenance. Not sure about the cost of living stuff, whether it's a good spend. I tend to think that certainly on public transport, it's a little bit hard to work out the distributional implications of it. And the rego rebate, it's similarly. I haven't looked at the details, but I think they're funding the rego rebate this year. I think the budget's in better shape this year than they expected. That's why you've got to put in your claims for the rebate by the 30th of June. But I think the checks will be coming closer to the election. That's my guess. I'm not in favour of these one-off measures, by the way, because I don't think it's a good public spend. But I think you can expect a generous budget in image, if not reality. But remember, your job is to get to the reality. And so that's what you've got to use your time most productively on in the lockup. What is really happening? How do you get to the bottom of it? Now, I've given you some tips today, but do remember, as I said before, the Treasury officials are mightily helpful. We are very lucky. We've got a very good Treasury, and they'll be a great asset. You'll also have VCOSS in the room, and I think we'll be talking about that shortly, about the help that they'll be there to offer you if you need assistance. But on that, I'll wind up, Juanita.
Thank you so much, David. So much in that. Well, I'm scribbling notes all over the place, David, on a number of things, and I know others will be too. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. I do want to we want to hear from you. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A chat. And we do have a couple that have come through, quite a few that have come through already, David.
Oh, that's
so
good.
I'm going to kick off with one of the questions. That
people were listening.
People were listening. People are absolutely listening. And so this is the first question for you, David. Now, you flagged several budget tricks to watch for. From a community sector reader sitting down with the budget papers on Tuesday, what's the single most important one to be alert to, and how do you spot it?
Oh, look, it's really adjusting for inflation and population growth, making sure that the spend is increasing, that it's not falling in real terms. And do bear in mind that the latest CPI increases of the CPI is up to 4.6%. If it keeps at that rate, that's a pretty hefty increase you're going to need to see in your program for it not to be falling in real terms. So that's the single most important one. Together with the population growth, just make sure you add those two together and compare it to the percentage change in your program. That's the one that I'll be looking at.
That's a great steer, David. And also we'll be looking very closely at that CPI projected rate, because that forms a part of the indexation formula, which now applies to many community service organisations in Victoria. So it's a key component of that formula. And by when we know the annual wage decision, we'll have the other key component of that formula as well. So that's a really important one for us to watch out for. Does the budget generally include support for agriculture, businesses and manufacturing development targeting economic growth?
It does, but it's not very much. The states don't spend a lot on those programs. You can have a look at that. All that's in the budget, but it doesn't amount to very much. The big spending portfolios are health, education, transport. They're the big ones. And if you want to aggregate it, families, fairness and housing is pretty big too.
And thank you, that's great. I'm just checking with my colleagues in the room that you can hear me on the excellent, fantastic. I do apologise. I think we had some technical difficulties before with my microphone, so I've taken that off now and we're all good. David, mindful that you've talked about the budget lockup and you're a seasoned veteran in the lockup, VCOSS will also be in the special interest lockup, and I know a number of the peak bodies and other service providers that are on this call today will be. Many will not be as well, and they'll be sitting in offices or in homes looking at the document, or seeing the updates as they come through on the socials and that sort of thing. What are the relative benefits, and what would you give perhaps a tip for those not in the lockup versus those in?
Yeah, I think being home these days is not that bad, or being in the office, because you can download the documentation pretty quickly. It all goes up as soon as the Treasurer gets up to give their the budget talk, all of the budget documents are immediately available on the internet. You can download them. They're giving you tips about where to look. And as I said, don't go to budget paper 1 because you're wasting your time. If you're not in the lockup, you've got a more compressed time to form a view and a judgment that's available for a media release. So you need to know, just reflect on what it is that I've said, and I'm sure we'll make these slides available to people about where to look again. But just make sure you choose your time wisely. I was just thinking on the way in on the train, actually, Juanita, that one of the other things, if you're not used to doing this or you've been to 1 or 2 before, it's not a bad thing before the budget lockup to download or get access to last year's budget papers, just to remind yourself what you're going to face when you go in there on Tuesday. You know, have a look at budget paper 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Have a look at the content so that you're familiar with it, because it's a bit of a race on the day, and you really want to kind of have in the back of your mind, go, you know, to what I do, I know where I've got to look. So I just go through a whole lot of stuff and I can pull out the key information really quickly, and just going between the budget papers. If you're new, it's trickier. So make sure you're prepped well, and you've got that advantage of being able to look at, sort of like looking at last year's exam, you know what I mean, in preparation.
Yeah, great. But just to, and just to clarify as well, you know, those who are in that lockup space have a little bit of an advance, you know, look at the budget papers, and particularly for the purposes of speaking to media on the day, who are often there right outside that building wanting an immediate response. And as I say, VCOSS will be there, but it doesn't mean that those who are not in the lockup can't offer, you know, commentary or indeed put out a release and that sort of thing as well. I mean, that's an open playing field and anyone can do that.
Anybody can do that, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think VCOSS has played a very helpful role in harnessing the voices of the sector to be able to get a good messaging out, without necessarily being one message, but it's making sure that people are singing from the same tune, if you like.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's a bit of collective knowledge on the day,
Yes.
about
It's very helpful.
feeling where the winds are blowing.
Yep.
Regarding volunteering, this one, what financial factors should we be looking for in this budget? And can we mount an argument for more support for this, for volunteering?
Look, you can do, but again, it's a very small spend in the budget, and quite frankly, I don't even know where you'd go to have a look. Look, of course, from a government's point of view, it's very happy to have volunteers by and large, as long as you pass all the necessary checks, because it's cheap. So yeah, whatever they spend on volunteers, it's a tiny amount of a $115 billion budget. So.
Fantastic. And apart from cutting expenditure, what other avenues will the state government use to increase its revenue?
Look, the one thing that happens, funnily enough, governments don't mind inflation because it'll mean that revenues come in a bit faster just because people are spending more, if you know what I mean. So tax revenues will just be a bit higher. They prefer economic growth. Economic growth delivers. So if you've got more people employed, you've got more payroll tax. If the property market is really clicking and going gangbusters, more stamp duties, land tax. So without having to change the tax rates or introduce a new tax, you're just going to get more money in your coffers. But remember, the opposite is also true, that if the economy is starting to contract or slow down, less people employed, less payroll tax. If the property market is slowing down, there's less payroll, there's less stamp duties, less land tax. So land tax is the stamp duties and the land tax are the two big ones to look for. So The Age has been running a few stories projecting a tightened or slowing housing market and the impact that'll have on the budget. It could be pretty severe based on the numbers that I've seen. So 2 things to look at. Victoria, one other thing just to bear in mind, Victoria has introduced an enormous lot of new taxes over the last 10 years, like eye-popping, something I never thought would have been possible. And what's good from our point of view is that they don't appear to have actually slowed the economy. So despite all the predictions of doom and gloom, the economy's been doing pretty well, as has employment. But those tax revenues are very important as a vehicle for funding additional services. And just as an example, you know, nobody's talking about the mental health levy that was imposed, a payroll tax surcharge, or the other taxes that have been put in place. There's a tax it's a couple of taxes. One tax in particular, it's the land tax surcharge that was put in place to try and pay back the coronavirus debt. That's due to expire in 2035. There's a number of taxes that'll just stop at the moment. Whoever is in government then is facing a potentially, I think it's something like a $2.5 billion hole in the revenue base. My guess is that as we get closer to that date, whatever government's in office is going to say, we're going to make this permanent, it won't be temporary. That surcharge, in my view, has been the main reason why the housing market, why housing's become cheaper in Victoria. It's actually policy success in a double way, generated revenue for services, slowed house price growth and made housing more affordable. I think it's been much more effective than have the planning changes. Bit of a long-winded answer, but just to double back a bit. Just remember, it's not just revenue increases; it's potential revenue declines. That's the one particularly to take into account. And also, do remember to think about gambling taxes are bad. They're really bad as a source of revenue, and the fees and fines really bad because they're so aggressive and have that other impact of people ending up in jail because they can't pay those fines.
Something we're looking at the moment. And finally, I think we've got time for maybe one or two more. Where can I find budget spend on transport particularly for older people and those with disabilities? Right, good question. The more detailed that your question is, the less likely you're going to find it in the budget. But if you want things like that, go to that service delivery budget paper that I referred to, and that has the detail. If you go to the transport, transport jobs and whatever the big mega department is, they've got the breakdown in there of the spend. But also remember what I said, these days that what's budgeted probably doesn't mean very much because of the contingencies. You know, they can top it up. So what ends up being spent, but that's where you can go to have a look. And also do remember, if you've got a question, where can I get that from? And you're in the lockup, put your hand up and speak to a Treasury official. They'll be very helpful. Great. Now, just you did a question coming out of your comments just now, David, about the mental health levy. There has been some interest in our sector about the mental health levy and how proceeds from it are being allocated. Is there a way to answer questions about allocation of funds to specific funding streams in the budget? Look, it's a good question. I don't think that there is actually. And it's a funny thing that economists don't like what's called hypothecation, where you introduce a new tax, you've got mental health levy and it goes to mental health. They prefer to have a tax so that it just goes into general revenue and then the government makes a policy decision to spend it on mental health, right? Trouble is, out there in Punterland, people like yeah, I'll spend more on mental health, I'll spend more on this, because they don't like the idea of a general kitty being available to be spent on public servants. But if it's for dedicated service, but to come back to the question, I don't think you can actually I don't think it's possible to tie the levy to mental health in a direct sense, because I think a lot of the mental health spending is still coming out of the consolidated fund. That's the levy is a top up, if you like. But what you can do, you'll probably be able to check to see that the spending on mental health is increasing, continuing to increase as it should be. You should be able to check that. And if you're unsure, again, go to a Treasury official and see if they'll give you that information. And last question just really beautifully segues into what you've just said. Many organisations will be concerned about lapsing programs. It's a chronic source of anxiety for our sector. Yeah. Is there anything in the budget documents that signals whether a program is likely to be secure beyond its short-term funding window? No, there's no, because it's all lumped in together. Then they tend not to give that sort of answer. Look, you might get some help from. There's also advisors that come into the lockup, and this year they'll be very keen that I think the sector's happy with what they've got. So you could pester them and ask them for assurances and checkups you do every year. But so the way they're structuring the budget now, there's a whole lot of programs that do lapse. And you can't be sure about which, what is going to happen. The intent is that they roll over, but there's the whole point of it is to make it contingent, so they can choose not to if they need to. Yeah, indeed, and something we talk to them a lot about, but also just that the buckets can sometimes be quite large, and so if you've got a particular program or an organisational allocation that you're looking for, you won't necessarily find that level of detail in the budget papers. So that is where VCOSS and others can interrogate either on the day or afterwards what does this budget line mean? Who's in and out of this line, and the more granular detail required underneath that. So it's a very big part of our work in the days after the budget announcement.
Yep.
So thank you, David. That's all we've got time for in terms of questions. And just on that, I did want to spend just a couple of minutes taking you through what you can expect from VCOSS, both on the budget day and across the budget week. So that you know where to look and how to make the best of our investment in our state's investment. So on the budget day itself, VCOSS will be in the formal budget lockup, as we've mentioned, alongside many members and peaks as part of the special interest group lockup. There's another separate lockup for journalists, as I understand it, an economist type. You're in that one, David, I know. So we're not often in the room together, unfortunately, but otherwise we'd ask you to tell us all. But we'll be in the special interest lockup, and we will issue a media release on the day. That will include our immediate read on the budget at a high level and what that means for the communities that we serve. We'll speak to journalists, and we'll also spend time amplifying the messages of others who are commenting on budget investments or lack of budget investment on the day. From the day onwards, our team here at VCOSS will be scrutinising those numbers and having further follow-up conversations with our contacts within and across government to make sure that we understand at a more granular detail what the budget papers mean for our sector. And over the course of a week after the budget, we will publish a comprehensive policy analysis on the VCOSS website, which will cover the issues that matter most to our members and the people that you work with. And we're hopeful that the entirety of that comprehensive analysis will be available within the week after budget day. We'll also be, of course, this year looking at what are the implications of budget investments for our election work and our election focus. So we'll be calibrating those investments across what we are already thinking about in terms of strategic work in the lead up to November. And also, of course, many of you will be joining us on Thursday for the annual Treasurer's Lunch. We're delighted to have Treasurer Jacqueline Symes again joining us for a lunch, this time at the Melbourne Town Hall. And this event is sold out. So if you have a ticket, we're really looking forward to seeing you there. If you are not going to use your allocation of tickets, please get in touch with Amy and the team here at VCOSS, because we do have people who are hoping to get into that event. We do have a wait list. So thank you in advance to let us know if you are not able to attend. Now, I think that probably is about bringing us to a close of the meeting. I just wanted to check with the team here. Are there any other questions? Anyone online have any questions about budget week, about VCOSS's role and activities over the course of the week? Just going to leave a little moment there for any questions, but nothing coming through. All right, fantastic. Well, that does bring us to the close of today's session. It does look like we're in for a ride, David, and whatever the budget delivers, we won't stop pushing. We will continue to advocate as forcefully as we can in the sector's interests and in the interests of the communities that we serve in pursuit of a fair, inclusive, caring and equitable Victoria. That is our main reason for being, and we are so grateful for the support that we have from you, our VCOSS members. Thank you so much, David, for the insights that you've shared with us this morning. As always, you've given us such valuable tools to cut through the noise and understand how we can make the most of either our time on budget day together or looking at those documents online or in other networks. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Anita.
And thank you also to the VCOSS crew who work really hard behind the scenes to make this and other VCOSS events a reality. A big shout out to Amy and Miriam for their work to pull this webinar together today. And thank you for your time and also for your questions. We look forward to checking in with you again soon over this big week and a half or so coming up. Take care and have a great day.